Music theory and Excel, mapping out modal ranges. Modal ranges? I've never heard that term before. Okay, a lot of people probably haven't heard that term before, but that's okay. It's a very useful term. So get ready and some coffee, because you ain't never seen rockin' unless you've excelled at rockin'. And that's what we do. Here we are in Excel. If you don't have access to this workbook, that's okay, because we'll basically build this from a blank worksheet. But if you do have access, 4 tabs down below. Fretboard, example, practice, blank, the fretboard tab, having a simulated fretboard that will be referring back to. The example tab, having the finished product, in essence, the answer key. The practice tab, having pre-formatted cells so you can practice the practice problem with less Excel formatting. But if you don't have any of that, that's okay, because we'll be working in the blank tab, building it from scratch on, in essence, a blank worksheet, practicing both our Excel skills as well as our music skills, noting that those two should be combined because Excel is important and visualizing tables is quite helpful. Let's go on over to the fretboard tab to get an idea of what we will be doing, why we will be doing it, because this is the point, people, where we're going to go a little bit off the rails. But that's okay, because the train, it only goes so far, and the gold, it's up in them there hills. So at some point, we're going to have to put our boots on, get our walking stick out, and go off the rails, and that's okay. What are we trying to do here? We're trying to come up with some measurement type of system for distances from any interval, which is typically one way that we can define our chord. So it's going to be a very important concept. What's the terminology that currently is used? They're called intervals. Now, the problem with intervals, however, is that they're based on scale degrees. So the scale degrees are the thing that's going to pull us out of what we would like to be doing in terms of a permanent modal-based numbering system, kind of similar to what you see in a Nashville music system, except the Nashville music system does it by writing all the songs as if they're in the key of C, even if they're not, right? So that we don't have to change the relative number position for the chords that come up. But what I would rather do instead is say, hey, look, I would like to list whatever song, whatever key it is in, and then recognize an absolute modal numbering system. So I'm first want to be thinking about our distance measurements that way, because I'm going to come up with the same question all the time, which is, what if we were going to build the system today? Would we build it the same way as it has been constructed historically? I would think in this point, no, is my argument. No, it would not. And then if we learned a system that would be faster the way they might design it today, if they had all the parts on the table, is it worth learning that way? And then, because you're then going to have to learn how to bridge it to the current system for communication of intervals. And my argument would be yes. So note that I'm going to introduce a terminology for distances then that's going to be based on the distances between any of the nodes within the system. And I think if you were to build the system today, that would be the natural kind of thing to do. And then we'll be able to bridge that terminology to the current system where you have scale degrees. And even if you don't want to keep using this terminology and you want to go to scale degrees, hopefully that'll kick your mind out of the problem that you will most likely hit when you learn scale degrees, which is going to be, it's going to force you out of the modal system, because you're going to start to say, how do I measure how far something is? I have to make that the one. How do I measure how far this is from this note? Well, we would call that a 5-note away perfect fourth, a perfect fourth. What does the 4 stand for? A scale degree. So that means that this would be the 1 then in the scale, but I don't want it to be the 1. I want to keep it as absolute mode number 6. So this is where the problem comes in, and I explain it kind of like if you had the basketball hoop, right? The basketball hoop is 10 feet tall, and you've got a 3-foot kid here, right? And you're trying to say, okay, how high is it from the top of the kid's head to the top of the basketball hoop? How would you measure that? A scale degree concept would be like taking the head of the kid as the foot number 1, making that the scale degree, 0.1, and then measuring up to the top of the basketball hoop, coming up with 8 feet, or it's 8 units away. It's like, well, no, that's not how you would normally do it. You would measure from the top of his head and come up with 7 feet. He's 3 feet and then 7 feet. Similarly here, what I'd like to be able to say, hey, we've got 7 nodes in our system. There's 12 notes in the musical alphabet, and we have 7 notes that are mapped out along the fretboard. I don't need to rename the notes in order to measure distance. What I can do is measure the distance from the note, and that's going to be the concept. And what the current system is doing is making us rename whatever note I'm on to the 1, just in terms of the terminology. Now, if you have that in mind, you can still use the interval language, but don't let it throw you off. Don't let it force you out of learning the fretboard. So remember, how I would recommend learning the fretboard is not necessarily by the notes and not necessarily by the relative position, because then you would have to learn 7 different relative positions for all different modes, but rather by an absolute numbering system. So once we have an absolute numbering system, then we need to be able to look at the relationship between all of the nodes. And if you do that, you can actually map out all of your chords by listing the node positions, right? You can list the node positions within the chords, and that's actually a much more specific way to list those out. We'll get into chord naming later. The chord naming also throws us off because they're only based on the major and minor scales. And so again, that kind of throws us off to what we would like to do, which is measured by the modal unit, right? The absolute numbering system. So that's going to be the idea. Now remember, most people on the guitar in particular don't understand distance, meaning they're going to learn the shape. So like if I learned from here to here, that's how far away is that? It's 5 4-note distance. They probably don't, a lot of people don't know it's 4 notes distance. They know it's a major third just by the shape. And the third doesn't stand for the distance in half steps. It stands for the relative scale degree. So I have to make that the 1 to say that's the third. If I go over here, this is also a third of a major third of that. But notice this is what I would like to call position 5. So when I say it's a third, that forces me to call this the 1. So I can say, well, if that's the 1, that must be the third scale degree. That's what I want to try not to do, because I want to keep that as absolute mode number 5, right? So we're gonna learn some terminology that will lead into the scale degrees, and I think even if you don't keep the terminology, it'll give you a more intuitive understanding of what the scale degrees mean, which are very important because that's how we build kind of our chords, or at least name the chords. All right, let's go to the example tab. What are we gonna do? We're gonna list out our alphabet again. We're gonna then list out our modes. So this is the baseline, then the modes, and then we're gonna build what I'm gonna call modal ranges, and that will lead into the concept of intervals. But I think this would be the more intuitive way to do it if, like, you were a computer programmer building the most efficient system from this point, right? I think this is more like what you would want to do. And I think when you practice, this is more like how you'd want to practice. Why? Because you'll go faster, right? You'll learn faster. So let's go back on over to the blank tab. All right, let's format this whole thing. I'm going to select the triangle, right click, and I'm going to say format the cells, and let's make it currency, and let's get rid of the dollar signs. Let's get rid of the decimals and say OK, and then I'm going to say make it bold. Now I'm going to put the standard format that we have been using for our baseline 12 notes. I'm going to do it fairly fast because we've seen it before. I just want to rebuild it, and I want to just be able to build my table nice and easy, nice and quickly. So I'm going to put a dollar sign. This is going to be the notes and numbers. So this is going to be note numbers, let's say. And I'm just going to go 1, whoops, that's 12. 1, 2, and select those 2. Put my cursor on the fill handle, drag it down to 12. To 12, boom. And then I'm going to go, okay, and then I'm going to put the letter, which I'm going to use my abbreviated letters, A, and then AB means that it's A and a half, A.5, right? Or it's in between A and B, otherwise known as it's either an A sharp or a B flat, but that's too long for our Excel sheet. So we're going to do it the way that makes the most sense, so I don't spend all my time spelling things, because that's not what I like to do. Spelling is not my thing. I want to make it so I can maneuver the stuff around and try to learn what's happening. Modes. You could walk out on the spelling if you want, but I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. Oh, let's do over here. Then we're going to say this is going to be the number and letter. So now we'll combine them together. And so sometimes I'm debating whether the number or letter would be better first. Let's try putting the letter first. I think I've been going on that. So I'm going to say equal the letter and then and the number. And is going to be computer or Excel code. We'll just tie them together. Boom, A1. And then double click the fill handle, pulling it down. All right, and then I'm just going to make it repeat 2 times by saying this equals the one up top, the 1. And I'll copy that across, fill handle, and then I'll copy it down. And it goes down to 12. So now we've got 2 rows of that. MUI B to the N, BN. Let's go ahead and make this top bit header formatting. I like to go Home tab, font group, dropping it down, black, text, white, centered, and then this bit down to the 12, 1 round, 1 circle. I like to make that blue. If you don't have that blue, it's in the more blue. It's in the standard. That's the blue right there, but bam. And then I'm gonna make it bordered. And then the second half, just so we can see it's repeating here, make it a slightly different color, making that, let's make it green and bordered. All right, let's select these items. Maybe I can put number this way, number and letter. Maybe that'll be a little tighter, so then I can tighten it up. Let's say number and then put this here so we can tighten this up a bit. And then I can select these 3, double click in the middle bit and tighten it up. All right, so now we're gonna say, I'm gonna first think about ourselves in the key of C, just to name the system in the key of C. So how would that work? It would be, our formula would be C, whole step from C gets us to D, whole step gets us to E, and then there's a half step gets us to F, and then a whole step to G. We could take another whole step around the circle, which would get us to A, or to this A. I'll make it a slightly different color to note that we're in the bottom second round here, and then a whole step to B, and then a half step back home to C would be the idea, and then it would repeat. It would also repeat up top. If we went around the circle up here, let's just make that a slightly different color. Boom, boom. So that's going to be our formula. So if we're in the key of C, we can just name these then. The first one's called Ionian. Now this is where people don't like the name. You can use the Nashville number system. It's the 1, right? But I want to make it an absolute number 1, no matter what the tonic is. And the Dorian, and then the Phrygian, and then the Lydian, and then, hopefully I'm spelling these right, then Mixolydian. I told you spelling's not my thing. And then the Aeolian, and then, I'm starting to like the names a little bit more. I've been saying them a lot though. Locrian. Makes me feel sophisticated. I speak ancient Greek. I'm not even sure if it's modern Greek, you know. I speak ancient Greek. I'm about to go read the Iliad and the Odyssey in its original format. I'm going to put the abbreviation for D or I, D, P, Y, X, A, and N. That's going to be my abbreviations for them. Let's make them boom. Double click here. All right. So here's our baseline layer, and then I'm going to pull out the 7 notes. So let's make this a skinny. I'm going to make a skinny F, put my cursor between the F and the G, make a skinny so it's not right next to it. And this is going to be C, this will be D, this will be E, this will be F, this will be G, this will be A, this will be B, and then it goes back to C. So if I was to number those, what do we get? We get 1, 2. I can copy that down, we get a 7-note system. That would be our collection of notes or our scale. Let's double click, select these two, double click. All right, and then if I name the nodes, now again, the scale, I'm just thinking of these as points, a point. So this point, I'm gonna call it the Ionian. I'm just gonna abbreviate it. You could abbreviate it Ion, Door, if you don't wanna spell the whole thing. Free, because I have them, I know them so intimately that I give them a little nickname. Ao, 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 Zeolin. All right, that's not Greek, that's Italian. Italian's a Greek, Latin-based, I don't know. That's how they would have, I don't know how they would have said it. You don't know what you're talking about, man. I'm gonna say this is gonna be an I, this is a D, and this is gonna be a P, and this is gonna be a Y, and this is gonna be an X, and this is gonna be an A, and then this is going to be an N. Okay, so that's our abbreviations for our points if we were in the key of C. So I'm gonna double click here to do it, and let's make this like orange maybe. Those are the orange notes that we pulled in. And then if I repeat that, we could repeat it, which would be going from C down. Let's copy it across this way. And then we could repeat it down. And then down to 7. Let's make that yellow. And yellow. Yellow. You say tomato, and I say it the right way. Okay, so I'm gonna say, let's make this paintbrush. Okay. All right, so let's scroll up now. So now I'm gonna name this modal ranges. Modal ranges. Have you ever heard of that before? Well, you should have heard about it, because this is the way you should be thinking about it. This is how you would think about it if you weren't locked in to a system that's not as efficient as it could be. I make the best, most efficient system. I don't care what happened in the past. So I'm gonna say, now, so the idea here is what I'd really like to do, I wanna intimately, on the fretboard over here, I wanna intimately know all of these nodes, and I wanna know the distance in terms of half steps and what I would call modal half steps, right? Scale degrees, if you wanna think about it like that as well. And if you do that, you have a lot better understanding of the fretboard, because the way the current interval system works doesn't tell you the node that you're on specifically all the time, right? It just tells you that it's a minor third or a major third, but that doesn't tell you, so those names don't really tell you the points that we're at. So it would be a lot better if you were able to say, hey, look, I'm looking at a range of any of these 7 nodes to any other of the 7 nodes, and I know how far it is in terms of what I would call it a modal half steps, distance and half steps in terms of a scale degree, as well as distance in terms of the number of actual notes. That would be way better efficient. It gives you a lot more ability to maneuver around the fretboard. So let's just remember our measuring tools. We can measure within here, within notes, where we have half steps and whole steps. But then these notes have been pulled. So we have 7 notes here, the orange ones out of the 12. 7 notes out of the 12. So I could measure this way, meaning I want this, if I think about these going in order, and I keep this numbering system the same, then I can think of this as a circle or as it repeats forever. And I can think about whatever node I'm in, how many nodal half steps, I'm going to introduce that term, right? How many nodal half steps is it from any point? Because the current system is going to force us to rename everything. And if I'm measuring from this point, I'm going to call it the Dorian mode, make that the 1. I don't want to do that. I want to say, hey, look, no, if I'm on the Dorian point, I want to measure from that point. There's 2 ways I can measure it. One is I can measure it within the modes here, meaning if I'm going up to the Lydian, I would call that 2 modal half steps, or 1 modal whole step, if you want to think about it that way. This distance will be different than the distance over here, because these notes have been drawn from the 12 notes on this side. So when I look over here, it's going to be from this point to the F. What did I go from D to here to the Lydian? So it's actually 1, 2, 3 half steps away. So I'd like to be able to know both of those things. Now, when I look at a nodal half step or a nodal whole step, the total half step distance will not always be the same. That's the problem here. But it'll always be the same when I'm going from a particular node. So whenever I'm going from Dorian to Phrygian, it's always going to be the same distance in terms of half steps. So I need to know the node to node I'm going to, and then I can determine what the nodal half steps are from that point. And I can also then determine, I want to just know what the number of actual units are distance-wise, which will lead me into scale degrees will be off by 1. This is the classic off by 1 problem, basically, for a computer programming system, right? The computer programming system numbered everything. Instead of starting at 0 for these relative numbering systems, they started by 1, and now everything is really off by 1 compared to what we would like to do, is basically what's happening here. Okay, so let's say, for example, that we're in the key of C. So I'm going to say we're going to start then always on the Ionian. So we're going to say now we're on the Ionian, which I'm going to call number 1. And so we're going to start on the Ionian. And I can compare, I can also see it this way. Let's go beginning. So let's do it this way. This equals this. This equals this. But this time I'll do it in symbols. So this is going to be the I. And then this is going to be the I. Let's do it this way. Well, I'll keep it on that for now. So what's going to happen then is I can compare each of these. I'm going to say this equals the 1, and I'm going to pull that down to 7. Well, wait a sec. This equals the 1. Pull that down. Now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. One more time. I want to pull it down because I'm going to copy it across later, so I'm going to try to format it so I can do that. And then this is always going to be 1, and this is going to be this plus 1, and I'll copy that down. So in other words, what are all the different, and let's do it this way. So this is going to be, if that's I, I'm going to copy this down. Well, wait a sec. This is going to equal the I. Copy that down. And then this is going to be I from here. This is going to be the I from here. And then I can copy that down. So if I'm looking at it from the perspective of the Ionian as my root, then what are all the modal ranges that I can have? Well, I can either have an Ionian to Ionian. I can have an Ionian to a Dorian, which I would call from an absolute numbering system, like the Nashville numbering system. I'd be going from a 1 to a 2, or I could be going from Ionian to the Phrygian, which would be Nashville number system 1, 3. I can go from Ionian to the Lydian, which would be a 1, 4 modal range. Ionian to Mixolydian, which would be a 1, 5 modal range. Ionian to Aeolian, a 1, 6 modal range. Ionian to Locrian, 1, 7. Those are all the modal ranges. Those are all the distances if I put my point on the node that's Ionian. Those are all the distances we can have from the Ionian. But I'm going to list them in a range format, right? That's going to be the general idea. All right. So then we can say, okay, well, then that's fine. What would be if I'm going forward, which is what we would normally do, I'm going to call this modal half steps, MHS, versus note half steps. So there's 2 ways that we can measure this. The modal half steps are going to be the end point minus the beginning point. End point minus beginning point, which is obviously 0 if it's Ionian to Ionian. So let's start here. Let's keep it going here. And then I'm going to say, what's the modal half steps? Well, if I number it, now I'm going, Dorian is where my end point is, minus my start point, which is Ionian. So that means it's 1 modal half step going from the Ionian to Dorian. What if I'm going from Ionian to Phrygian? Well, the Phrygian is 3 minus 1. So I'm going to call that 2 modal half steps. So if I'm on the Ionian, it's 2 modal half steps, or you could say 1 modal whole step to the Phrygian. What if I'm going from the Ionian, the modal range of Ionian now the Lydian, the Lydian, it's going to be 4, Lydian is 4 minus 1. So if I go Ionian to Lydian, it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 steps up, okay? What if I'm going to the Mixolydian? Well, Mixolydian is 5 minus 1 Ionian. So the range of Ionian to Mixolydian modal range is 4 modal half steps, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4. See how we can just do that? So now we're going to say modal range of Ionian to Aeolian, modal range of Ionian to Locrian. Boom. So those are all the modal ranges that we can have in terms of modal range. Now notice you might recognize those numbers as being off by 1 if you know your scale degrees, right? What do I mean by that? I mean, if I add 1 to each of these, that's going to be what we'll see later as the scale degrees. So that's why I think this terminology will be useful to you, because you can actually measure things the way I think properly you should be measuring them, not renaming the point you're naming as the 1, but keeping it as 0, or not renaming it because you're just basically telling me the distance from that point, right? And then it will always be off by 1 in essence. So if you had the scale degree format, this would be the 7th, right? It's going to be off by 1. So then we're going to say, all right, well, let me give me the notes then. Okay, so if I take the notes, then I could say, all right, let me do that over here. This is going to be the actual distance in notes. If we're going from Ionian to Ionian, we're going to say, all right, let's say, well, it would be 4, this 4 minus this 4, right? And that's going to be 0. And then if I'm going to the Ionian to Dorian in total notes, here's the Dorian. That's what I call the 6, note number 6, minus note number 4. So the total distance is 2 notes away. So notice the terminology I would be using here is I would like to say that this is a modal half step of 1 from the Ionian, which is the note half steps of 2, right? And but obviously, if you think of it from scale degrees, it's going to be the second. The second, there's a 2 note away second, because we would rename the first not as 0 but as 1. So let's do this one. I'm going to go, okay, this is going to be going from the Phrygian. So let's go on over here to the Phrygian. Is going to be an 8 for our notes, and then we're going to subtract the Ionian, which is 4. So we come out to a distance of 4. So I would call this a 2 modal half step away, right? I'm sorry, yeah, it's a 4 note away second modal half step, let's say. So we use a similar term, which would mean that the scale degree would be the 4 note away third. All right, so we'll talk about scale degrees later, but let me just do this one. So this one's going to be here. So we're going to say Lydian is a 9, note number 9, minus the 4. Okay, so what would I call this? I would say distance-wise from Ionian, this is going to be let's do it this way, a 5 note away third modal half step, which means that it's going to be the 4th scale degree, perfect 4th. Okay, so we'll talk about the scale degrees later. I just want to kind of lead in the terminology so you can see what's happening here, because I think this would be the natural way to do it, but it's always off by 1 because of the scale degree format, not numbering again the scale at 0 but rather as 1, making us renumber the system. So here let's do it again. So we're going to say this is going to be Mixolydian minus the minus the 4 for the notes. So I'm going to call this a 4 note away 4th modal half step, which would lead to the 5th scale degree, which would be a 7 note away perfect 5th. Okay, so then we're going to say this one's going to be equal, and again, if you don't know the perfect 5th yet, we'll do that later. This is going to lead into the intervals. I want to show you how it bridges the two. It lets you measure it what I think is properly, but also gives you the idea of what you're actually doing and bridges into the current scale degree terminology, so that you can either keep this terminology, or when you go to the scale degrees, you can have a better sense of what's actually happening, not allowing the terminology to force you out of the most efficient way to think of the fretboard from a measurement standpoint. All right, so let's go then to the Aeolian. So now I'm going to go to the Aeolian minus the 4. Now this one, because it repeated, is going to give us a -3. I don't want it to be negative, so what am I going to have to do? Well, there's 12 notes. I'm going to say plus 12 gets us to the 9. So what is this going to be? It's going to be a 9-note away 5th modal half step from the Ionian, which means it's going to be the 6th scale degree. So it's going to be a 9-note away major 6. All right, one more time. This one's going to be the Lydian minus 4. So once again, that's negative, so I'm going to have to say plus 12 because it goes around in a circle. So that's going to be 11 notes away. So what would I want to call this? An 11-note away 6th modal half step, which leads to the 7th scale degree. So it would be an 11-note away, from scale degree standpoint, an 11-note away major 7. Okay? So I know it was a little wonky. I got a little wonky. It takes a little while to get lined up, but I hope you get the idea. So let's go ahead and pull this in a bit. Let's make this a little bit tighter. All right, and then let's see if we can color code this, and then I'll do the other scale degrees next time. Let's just clean it up right now, and just hopefully you have the idea, and then we're kind of running long. So let's go Home tab, font group. Let's make this black, white, and then let's make this, I like to make this whole thing blue. Let's make it blue and bordered to start off with, at least. Blue and bordered. Now, there's one other thing I want to introduce before we stop this. Notice that when I look at a scale degree, if I'm going, I could go forward. So this is why I said forward here. But we can also think about how far back would I have to go, which would be the inverse distance. Now, a lot of times this is another problem when we use our normal distance terminology, we don't usually think about going backwards, right? Because we then say, when we go backwards, we say we have to do the inverse. Let me show you what I mean. If I go back on over here, the current way we normally think of things is like, okay, if I'm going from the C here up to the D, how far is that? Well, that's 2 notes away. From a scale degree standpoint, we would say that's a 2-note away major second. It's a whole step, but from scale degrees, 2-note away major second. Well, what if I go behind it then? How far back would I have to go? Or let's go this way. Let's go this one right here. How far away is that? That's a 1, 2, 3, 4-note away. From a scale degree standpoint, it would be a 4-note away major third. Well, how far back would I have to go? You have to go, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which makes sense because it's 12, right? It's 12 minus 4, which would give us 8 steps back. So I could either go up forward or I can go back 8. Okay, but there's not really a terminology for going back 8. I'd have to use the inverse to think about basically going back 8. So that's another issue that we're gonna dive into a little bit when we get to the terminology for the intervals. So it doesn't include distance. Clearly, we would like to include distance, particularly on a fretboard, because I'd like to be able to count backwards behind where I'm going and see that as different than going forwards rather than having to call it the inverse. But we'll get into that later. But we can introduce that idea with the modal ranges, because if I just call this a modal range, if I'm saying the modal range is an Ionian to the Phrygian modal range, it's an Ionian Phrygian modal range. That's a 4-note away, second modal half step, which would result in the 3rd scale degree, right? But I can also say, using a modal range, that you could go back then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So what's the modal range? It's either forward 4 or back 8. So the modal range, I think, is a little bit more flexible that way because you can either say modal range going forward, modal range going backwards if you wanted to. So let's go on over here and say, well, what if I went back then? Backwards. So the beginning and then the end would be what? So the beginning and end, actually it shouldn't be beginning and it should be, this equals the modal half steps and the note half steps if we're going backwards. So if I'm going from the interval of the Ionian to Ionian, then how far would that be? Well, we can take then, this is going to be in modal half steps, there's 7 of them. So I can take this minus 7, and that would take us all the way around back to the Ionian. This is going to be, there's 12, so it'd be this minus 12 because there's 12 notes. Now, if I copy that down, let's just do it here so I can see it. So if I go from Ionian to Dorian, so the 1 to the 2, it's 1 modal half step. If I go backwards, and there's only 7 modal half steps, it's going to be 1 minus 7. So that means it's going to be negative 6. I would be going back 6. So I can either go, if I'm going from Ionian to Dorian, I can either go 1 modal whole step forward, 1 modal half step forward, or 6 modal half steps backwards. What about in terms of total notes? Well, it's actually 2 notes distance minus how many notes are there? 12. So I can either go 2 notes forward or 10 notes backwards to get from an Ionian to a Dorian. That's always true, right? So that's always the case if you know these points on the fretboard. Okay, what about the modal range from the Ionian to Phrygian? So that's going to be 2 modal half steps. The Phrygian is 2 modal half steps up, or how many half steps back? Well, it'd be 2 minus 7. So you could go back 5 modal half steps. What about in total distance? Well, it's a distance of 4 notes. So 4 minus 12 notes means you could go forward 4 half steps in notes or back 8 half steps. All right, what if I go from Ionian to the Phrygian? Well, that's 3 modal half steps up. Or you can take 3 minus 7 and go 4 modal half steps back. What about note half steps? Well, it's 5 note half steps up minus 12, 7 note half steps back. What if I go from the modal range of Ionian to Mixolydian? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 modal half steps up. So that means 4 minus 7, it's 3 modal half steps back. It's 7 notes up minus 12 would give me 5 notes back. What about if I go from the modal range of Ionian to Aeolian? Well, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 modal half steps up equals 5 minus 7, 2 modal half steps back. Or it's 9 modal, or a note half steps up minus 12, 3 note half steps back. What if I go from the modal range Ionian to Locrian? Well, that's 6 modal half steps up minus 7 would be 1 modal half step back, and it's 11 note half steps up minus 12 gives me 1 note half step back, right? So then I can go, okay, let's go from, make this blue bordered, let's make this black and white, and let's take this whole thing and see if I can make it like the same range or the same distance. All right. And then I like to make these every other color, every other one like white. That might be a little bit easier to see. So you can see kind of the difference. So let's make this bit like green maybe, just to make it fancy. All right. So now we can see maybe and then let's make this top bit green, or let's make it from here maybe green across, or maybe let's undo that. Let's make this like green across, so we can see that whole bit is like the green bit, and then we've got these differences between the two. Okay, let's leave it at that. So I might have overwhelmed people with this one. Again, I think that some people are most likely going to say, what are you doing? This is like, that's not, but I really think that this is the way that naturally you'd want to see it. And again, even if you don't want to use this terminology, when we get to the interval naming, remember that this off by one problem is the thing that might force you away from what I think is the most optimal way to visualize the fretboard. If you can know intimately every point on this fretboard that are by the absolute mode number, and then you can know intimately the distance from between each of these points, then you can actually build all of your chords naming not the interval, not major, minor, but naming the actual nodes that are in the system. That's totally transferable, right? That's totally transferable as you copy and paste through all 12 keys in a way that remembering the notes in a chord is not. Memorizing the nodes in a chord is transferable through the whole thing, just like memorizing the shape is transferable. That makes, to me, that's like, it's so obvious that that's like way better way to spend your time, even if you have to then bridge the gap for communication purposes to then put it into the terms of major minor notation, as well as, which is easy to do if you understand like what you're doing. So notice here, again, I think it's way easier to actually think in terms of distance-wise with modal half steps, using simple math if we have a numbering system for an absolute numbering system for the mode, which can give us modal half steps easy, as well as actual distance with the numbering system for the note system. And then, of course, we can just accommodate for the scale degree system by saying it's going to be off by 1 if we measure it the way a normal person would measure. How high is it from the top of the kid's head to the basketball hoop? You don't measure the kid's head as foot number 1. All right, so you're going to be off by 1 to everybody else that measures the kid's head as foot number 1. But that's fine, because you could just bridge the gap and then do it the right way and then bridge the gap.